And hello. So each week on Shift Key, my co-host Jesse Jenkins and I pick one item of news from the wide world of climate and energy happenings. And if it's making us feel more upbeat about the energy transition, then we call it an upshift in matching our name, Shift Key. And if it's making us feel more downbeat, then we call it a downshift. So Jesse, there have been so many downshifts lately, and I feel like they're going to keep coming. But hopefully we'll have fun. What do you have for us?
Well, this is our first opportunity to talk about the big spat between Elon Musk and Donald Trump, which occurred last Friday on the 6th of June. Is a falling out that I think many of us expected at some point. You know, two men with egos that large have a hard time coexisting for long in an amicable way. But if you haven't read the Twitter and Truth Social back and forth, or x.com and Truth Social back and forth, you should go do that. I wanted to focus on what the implications of this spat might mean for the politics of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Senate's efforts to craft their version of the one big beautiful bill, as Trump calls it, the Budget Reconciliation Act that the Republicans are working on. I think going into this administration, as Elon Musk aligned himself with Trump, there were a lot of people that felt that that was a good sign for the future of EV policy, that Trump and Musk being tight would mean that Musk would have greater influence to defend policies supporting electric vehicles, policies that are good for Tesla's bottom line. And that ultimately he might save the tax credits or other policies supporting EVs from repeal. Now, however, as this spat unfolded, the heart of the matter for Musk has been the deficit impact of the budget bill, the fact that it would add something like $4 trillion to the deficit. He's called that disgusting. He's very concerned consistently about deficit impacts for whatever reason. But he basically said in his parting shot, you know, whatever, keep the EV solar incentive cuts in the bill, even though you're not touching the oil and gas subsidies, he notes, but ditch the mountain of, quote, disgusting pork in the bill. He doesn't actually care about the EV tax credits for whatever reason. He thinks that either they're not necessary for Tesla's success, or that if they hurt Tesla, they hurt all of his competitors. If losing those tax credits hurts Tesla, it hurts his competitors even more and leaves Tesla in a better off position at the end of the day. But he is not going to the mat to defend those credits. Instead, he's sparring with Trump in order to get more spending cut from the bill and to reduce its impact on the deficit. And to the degree that he's successful as the richest man in the world and recent force in politics, his arguments and his cash could strengthen the political case of the budget hardliners, the anti-spending hawks in the Senate, who are also trying to trim down the bill and are probably the single biggest barrier at this moment to some of the more moderate senators' efforts to lengthen the timelines for phase downs of certain tax credits, whether it's the EV credit or the clean electricity credits. So I read this as clarity that Musk is not going to defend these tax credits. In fact, he's happy to see them burn down. And his priority is to strengthen the folks who are fighting against any increases in the budgetary impact of this bill, which is going to make it very difficult for senators to extend IRA tax credits longer before they phase out.
It's interesting because I think there's been a question running all along, which is Elon stupid, ideological, or both? And I think there's a lot of evidence that he's ideological, right? And he's specifically ideological about the deficit. This is what motivates him seemingly to support Trump. And you can imagine a nightmare scenario here, though it's not totally convinced it's the one we're on, but I think you can imagine a nightmare scenario where basically Elon keeps talking about the deficit and the deficit expanding effort parts of this bill. He rejects the need for solar and EV and various other electricity tax credits. Enviros don't really want to compromise during Senate negotiations, and the whole IRA falls apart in the Senate because it's easier for the Senate just to throw out all the renewable parts. It's easier for the Senate to throw out.
Yeah, to basically just do what the House did.
Exactly. Well, first of all, let's note the greater irony that Elon keeps talking about the pork in the bill, right? He talks about how there's all this pork in the Republican tax bill. There really isn't a lot of pork in the Republican tax bill. You know, most of the spending comes from tax cuts that happened in the 2017 TCJA, the original set of Trump tax cuts. They're just extending all those tax cuts further. They might lower some rates, but for the most part, an extension of tax cuts that have already happened and were set to expire. That's where most of the spending is. And the rest of the spending is from directly Trump promised policies like no tax on tips
which he campaigned on alongside.
Which Elon supported, right? Exactly. Which Elon bankrolled a campaign to produce. And so when you look for pork in the bill, there's like this kind of nonsensical thing where it's like either policies that already exist that Elon, we assume, supported because
he backed Trump.
Or policies that Trump promised as part of his 2024 campaign that Elon explicitly backed, right? I have come to a more, I would say, obscure understanding, how would I put it? Like mystical and obscure and kind of opaque of what exactly is happening with Elon. If you look at a timeline, on August 5th, 2021, before the Inflation Reduction Act passed, when it was still called Build Back Better, first year of Biden's term, that's when Biden holds this EV summit at the White House that has representatives from Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, and the United Auto Workers, and not Elon, not anyone from Tesla. And that night, Elon goes like, oh, this is kind of weird. Maybe they should have invited me. And then after that, in the months after that, is when Elon really begins to shift. By December 7th, 2021, Elon says about what is still called Build Back Better, he says basically he would delete, quote unquote, the energy and EV provisions in the Biden reconciliation bill. And he says the federal budget deficit is insane. I would just get rid of this whole bill. By the time the IRA passes, Elon has already opposed the subsidies. And so then in 2024, when he begins to support Trump, he's been on the record for 2 years opposing these EV subsidies. Reporters repeatedly asked him, like, what about all the subsidies that Tesla benefits from? And he is like, oh, we don't need the subsidies. Tesla might get hurt a little bit in the short term, but in the long term, our values and autonomy, so I'm not worried about us. It's like other automakers that haven't caught up to us yet that are going to get hurt more. Through all of the early Trump administration, Elon is both basically disconnected from the leadership of his companies. And also there's a lot of coverage that these subsidies are not actually going away. We write stories that are like 21 House Republicans say they want to stick with the clean energy subsidies. Because the assumption was that the House Republican caucus would retain most of the subsidies regardless of what Elon says. And it's not until late May that the Elon-Trump split really begins to happen. And that is also after, number one, Elon has gone back and visited Tesla, and he's understood how important the modern set of subsidies are to Tesla's business. And he's understood it is not only the subsidies that we should be talking about, it's the entire set of tailpipe regulations from California and from the EPA and from the Department of Transportation that create this web of credit buying and selling plus tax credits that really provides a huge buffer to Tesla's bottom line. And then the House passes a bill that actually trashes these tax credits in a way that maybe Elon didn't expect. And so when you go from April 1st, 2024 to June 1st, 2025, not only the subsidy picture, but like the whole incentive and bottom line picture for Tesla looks totally different than you might have thought it would. Like at the beginning of the second quarter. And I do wonder if like Elon has then been more involved in his companies now and has also watched what he thought he could just kind of pundit about fall apart.
Yeah, it's possible that the bluff was called and now he's like, oh no, yes, I don't actually want this. But to be fair, you could have seen all of this coming. Trump also campaigned on getting rid of all of these regulations. He campaigned on getting rid of the IRA. And so like maybe Elon just didn't realize it, but this attack on the bottom line at Tesla has been there the whole time. It's just now it's on the precipice of actually happening. I don't know. We'll probably never know what's going on inside his head. But Rob, I think you've got a shift that's kind of related. So
yes,
over to you.
Exactly. I too have a downshift for the week. So last Thursday, the Senate Commerce Committee, in the middle of basically the Elon Trump meltdown, which is why this didn't get a lot of attention, released a new text of the Trump mega bill. This text actually made a change to one of the country's longest standing pieces of air regulation and fuel efficiency rules in a way that has not been noticed at all. So since 1975, the US has regulated tailpipe pollution and really the fuel efficiency of new vehicles sold in the United States with a law called the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards. It was first passed, as you might guess from the year, in the wake of the Arab oil embargo, and then in the mid-2000s, after the big oil shock of the mid-aughts, Congress, on a bipartisan basis, strengthened the rules. And since the mid-aughts, the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards, or the CAFE standards, have continuously improved U.S. fuel mileage. And they've gradually improved fuel economy in new U.S. cars and light trucks over time, to the degree that in model year 2023, which is the most recent year we have data, new cars and light trucks achieved a new real world fuel economy of 27.1 miles per gallon, which is an all-time high. We think they achieved another record high for model year 2024. The Trump administration, which has basically attacked tailpipe pollution standards from every angle, the EPA has a similar version of these rules, although it allows car makers much more freedom. It has attacked those rules. It's tried to undo them. Congress has tried to repeal them. This new Senate reconciliation text, what it does is it goes into this 50-year-old law passed by Congress, and it says, look, historically, what has happened is if you were an automaker and you didn't hit these standards, you had to pay a fine. And the fine was calculated by basically the number of cars that went over the standards for every 10th of a mile they went over the standards times $5. And these fines could be very large. They could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And the most recent company to be hit by the fine was Stellantis, paid something on the order of $426 million in penalties. This Senate reconciliation bill goes into that longstanding law and changes the $5 amount to zero. So any fine calculated under the CAFE law, which has been on the books, again, for 20 years to 50 years, depending on how you count things, is now automatically multiplied by zero. Automakers will never have to pay a fine for selling too many gas guzzlers, right? It seems like this is designed to, we know why this is designed. They're trying to repeal the CAFE rules, basically in a way that is permitted under the Byrd rules, which are the set of Senate procedures governing what you can bring up in Senate reconciliation bills, that Senate reconciliation bills have to affect revenue or spending. Basically, by zeroing out the fines, they think they can kind of soft repeal these laws. I think it still stands to see, because the reason these fines exist isn't actually to have a budgetary impact. It's to enforce compliance with the laws. So maybe this provision won't actually survive a birdbath. But if it does, it would undo one of America's two long-standing ways of regulating fuel economy from new cars and light trucks sold here. I have seen some people on social media say that this is actually a really good thing, because since the mid-aughts, these rules, the CAFE standards, have basically allowed car makers to meet laxer standards if they sold larger vehicles because of something called footprinting rules that Congress somewhat put in the laws, somewhat were then created as a regulatory creation. The government, the Department of Transportation, or NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which really makes the rules, when it writes these CAFE standards, it has to take into effect that larger cars are harder to make fuel efficient than smaller cars. And you have to respect that in the rules. And NHTSA then went and created these footprinting guidelines. And some people think, and I think there's some evidence to support this, that basically this has pushed car makers to make larger vehicles over time. And it has pushed car makers to stop selling sedans and to sell more larger truck-style sport utility vehicles. Now, I have some problems with this theory because I think it overlooks, number one, that consumer tastes have favored larger and larger vehicles over time. I think it overlooks the fact that other car markets have seen car bloat in the same way, but I'm open to the idea that car bloat has been a creation of these rules. I think that this is the worst possible way to solve it, though, because between NHTSA, between the CAFE standards going away, which is one way the U.S. regulates fuel economy in new cars, and the Environmental Protection Agency's greenhouse gas standards going away, which is the other way the U.S. government regulates air pollution in new cars, there's going to be no more regulation for fuel economy. And so if you're like, oh my gosh, car makers have really taken advantage of these rules, and now they're selling all these truck-like cars to consumers, and it's actually made cars less efficient overall, you're going to hate the new world where automakers do not face any regulations whatsoever for the fuel economy of cars they sell. Now, maybe it'll all work out in the end, and maybe there's some world that survives where the legal basis for the EPA greenhouse gas regulations stand, and the NHTSA CAFE rules go away because the EPA rules allow for more trading between different types of vehicles. This is another thing. Basically, oh my gosh, don't turn off the podcast. Keep listening. Because under the CAFE rules, you can't trade credits. You can't trade pollution credits as much between cars and light trucks. But under the EPA rules, because they're fully a creation of regulatory law and did not involve input from Congress, you can freely trade credits. There's a lot more credit trading in the EPA rules, while in the NHTSA rules, the CAFE standards, there's only so many credits that you can get from selling a lot of, say, hybrids if you also sell a lot of polluting vehicles. And this is historically, back in the teens, this was a problem for Toyota, which if you think about it, sells a lot of Priuses, but also sells a lot of Tacomas and big trucks. There is a kind of ideal world you can envision here where the greenhouse gas EPA standards stick around and the US is able to create a very flexible standard for fuel economy, for regulating fuel economy in new vehicles, but the NHTSA CAFE standards just go away. But I don't think we live in that world. I think we live in bad world where what's going to happen.
You don't think
as
we
a
live in an
result of
ideal?
No, I think what's going to happen is bad world where all of the rules go away and automakers can sell anything they want. And there's no regulation. There's effectively no regulation for selling gas guzzlers in the US anymore. And we very, very quickly get back to a world of like the Hummer H4.
No, the Hummer's...
So that's true, and it's very heavy.
It's enormous.
And it's very, very heavy. Well, that does it for today's episode of Upshift, Downshift. If you like this, you should listen to Shift Key, our weekly podcast where we talk about climate and decarbonization issues and the shift away from fossil fuels, and we don't do it on video. We're just in your brain talking to you. It's amazing. You can find us on any podcast app you use, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Heatmap.news, our website, or Deezer, the weird French one. And remember to like and subscribe if you just want to keep getting more videos like this. Thanks so much for watching.